This is the Clutch Picks Sports Betting Podcast. My name is Sheldon Alexander. Thank you for tuning into yet another season as we're here to take over the NFL by storm. I'm joined by my guy, Mr. Matt Russell, sports betting professional and creator of The Window, available on Substack and via podcast. Mr. Matt Russell, my friend, thank you for joining me again for another year. How are you, my friend?
Oh, God, brimming with excitement. The boys are back. We are back for another NFL season. I can't even count how many we're at here. Was this our fifth season together on various platforms? Man, I'm thrilled. So glad that you're having me back. So glad to see you. So glad to get into the NFL this season. And, you know, is it going to be more of the same, which should be good news? Or, you know, is this season going to get crazy like it pretty much always does? So I'm absolutely thrilled to be here and just, you know, beyond pumped to get this season going.
Yes, we are back here on the Clutch Picks Sports Betting Podcast, part of the ClutchPoints Network again. And thank y'all for coming back. Whether you've been with us along on the ride as we've switched up various iterations, but the vibes are all still the same because I want winners, in the wise words of my man, Mike Singletary. Big shouts. So some of you might be familiar with what we do here on the pod. Normally, week to week, what you can expect is me yelling into this microphone, making picks on each and every NFL game, while my man Matt here breaks down, comes in with the information and education on where the lines is, where it was, and where it could be going. And hopefully we all come out on the other end with a much more informed pick. That's my goal here. That's what we do here on the pod. But of course, the season before the season is getting in all of the futures picks, which is this is what we want to do here. What we shall do on this pod. We are going to break down each and every division. But instead of saying, hey, let's pick the Chiefs to win the AFC West, right, which is the obvious thing that everyone might be able to do, cool and easy, we try to break it down from more of a deeper dive gambling perspective and try to give you what we like to call a value bet for each division. So that's what we're going to do, diving into each and every division in the NFL, sprinkling in some props along the way. But let's start with the aforementioned AFC West. And of course, the aforementioned Chiefs, the Super Bowl winners, looking to win their third straight Super Bowl. Have you heard that yet? Have you heard that the Chiefs are trying to win third straight Super Bowl?
They might be good at this.
In the NFC West, or AFC West, pardon me, to win the AFC West, KC minus 250, the Chargers plus 350, Vegas plus 900, and Denver plus 1600. Now, we get it. The Chiefs do what they do, but there were points last season where they struggled a little bit. So as we seek value elsewhere in the division, is it just, are we narrowing in on Harbaugh and the Harbaugh factor here, as I feel like everyone's trying to talk themselves into Jim Harbaugh?
Listen, I think the Jim Harbaugh hire is a great hire for the Chargers, and I think he's going to get that turned around, and they're going to stop being unserious. The problem is they don't have the horses right now to be unserious, right? The talent level has dipped quite a bit from those years where we were all talking ourselves into the Chargers because at every level they had like this guy after this guy after this guy after this guy, right? And as much as like Khalil Mack had a really good season last year, it's like how many more of those can we sort of really sign up for? I'm no Joey Bosa guy. Like I feel like he's wildly overrated. So if you kind of go, I'm not really sure about those two guys, the top player list on that team kind of becomes Derwin James, who at safety, it's the least important position on the field by and large. There's nothing really in the wide receiving core. There's nothing really that you can get excited about in the running back core. And obviously Rashawn Slater is a top level left tackle, and Justin Herbert is, you know, I mean, listen, we're not going to get into a Justin Herbert debate here, but I think Justin Herbert's pretty damn good myself. So beyond that, it's like, it's kind of a rough scene as far as the talent level is concerned for the Chargers. So I don't think that's going to happen this year. But what happens here with Herbert and Harbaugh is that somebody has to be the second choice in the AFC West, right? And like you would gravitate to that combination because the third choice in the division is Antonio Pierce and Gardner Minshew. And speaking of talent deficiencies, right? It's like Devontae Adams on offense and Max Crosby on defense. And then it kind of gets really grim after that. So they're even in a worse spot. And so I just look at this and I go, okay, the reality is the Chiefs are probably a valuable bet to win the AFC West because they do it all the time. And even at minus 250, we're talking about, a better than 65, 68, 69, 70% chance. And it's like, I kind of think there's a better than 70% chance that the Chiefs win the division. But this is the NFL, and I'm not looking to tie up minus 250, like a 2.5 unit bet to win 1 unit for 17, 18 weeks this season.
Yeah.
And because it's the NFL, and as much as Patrick Mahomes is largely unscathed injury, been unscathed by injury, though, we have seen him get hurt, and he somehow is like, okay, good to go to win that Super Bowl 2 years ago. Oh, somehow he's back after a week after like dislocating a kneecap, 3 years ago against Denver. It's like, the whole thing is just one giant roulette wheel, right? Where eventually the ball is going to land on, like it did with Tom Brady after a historical 2007 season, right? It lands on Tom Brady. He ends up out in the first game of the season. All of these guys, Joe Burrow last year, go on down the line with like quality
even if you just go back to last year, how they were able to survive with no receivers at all. Travis Kelce's up there in age. Now he's just a year older, and it's not like they drastically improved their receiving core. They've improved it, but it's not like level. Do you know what I mean?
Listen, the team that they have now, even they lost a couple of pieces on defense, obviously L'Jarius Sneed going to Tennessee, they lost a couple pieces on defense, and they were a defense first team, which was always a weird thing to sort of feel like with Kansas City, and we had to like wrap our head around that throughout the season last year. But my point is, like, there isn't really anything to kind of compete with in the AFC West, so an injury kind of has to happen for somebody to jump up. So, okay, well, if there is an injury to happen, who of those other 3 teams, and we haven't got to the Denver Broncos yet, who are widely available at as high as 20-1 out in the market in the AFC West. And like, it's one thing when you're looking at the Chargers plus 350, plus 400. It's like, oh, like, okay, like I'm not really getting paid out here on a Patrick Mahomes injury. Yeah. Even Vegas at like 9-1, it's like I'm not really getting a huge payout on Patrick Mahomes getting injured. And again, he doesn't have to be out for the season, but like, what if the Chiefs are without him for 6 games? Yeah. Right? A 12-5 season all of a sudden turns into kind of like a 9-8 type of a season. And so, like, what's the team that has? I mean, listen, every one of these teams has technically a new coach, obviously, other than the Chiefs. But like the one guy who I think might have, have gotten through that first year last year and has the chance to have his biggest effect is Sean Payton. Okay. And he's making a bet. Speaking of bets, he's making a bet that Bo Nix is that dude. And I can think Sean Payton's a little crazy. I can think that Sean Payton is like, maybe not, maybe not as great as he's thought of, but I can also bet at 20-1 that maybe this Broncos team has a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm and maybe a little bit more talent than they're given credit for. And then maybe that offense will run pretty smoothly against Bo Nix, who, by the way, isn't some like 19-year-old rookie. He's in there with Zach Wilson. Zach Wilson feels like he's been around forever. Bo Nix is the same age as Zach Wilson. Like, think about that for a second, right? And going back to Auburn, going back to Oregon, like he played a ton. This isn't like a Mitch Trubisky played 10 games and got drafted second overall type of thing, right? Mm-hmm. So if Sean Payton, a offensive intellect, if you will, thinks that Bo Nix can process the things that starting quarterbacks in the NFL need to process, he can get the ball to some pretty decent talent on the outside, Cortland Sutton, and then hand the ball off to a stable of running backs that is pretty good in front of an offensive line that's been the strength of their team for a couple of years now. So I just go, you know what? I get it. If you want a value play, yes, technically Kansas City is actually valuable at the price that they're getting or that they're being offered at. But if you're out there finding a 20-1 on the Broncos, I don't hate that to sort of start this show off as kind of a crazy sort of play. But there are so many markets available these days. Back in the day, it was like, okay, to win the division and that's it. You can bet on the Broncos to finish second in this division.
I was just going to say that.
Plus 600, plus 650, I even saw as of last night. And it's like, okay, like I think the Broncos can be better than the Chargers and better than the Raiders. Yeah. What would be wild if like the Chiefs somehow, like, like I said, like a Mahomes injury happened and like the Chargers ended up winning the division and the Chiefs finished second and the Broncos finished third, and you're just sort of like, oh man, like we kind of had it right, even though like we didn't have it right, type of thing. But yeah, like if you told me like if we just removed the Chiefs from the equation and the Broncos are plus 650, be better than these other two teams, who, like I said, I think are just as devoid of talent relative to the Chiefs as the Broncos are, like I like that bet. Like, give me the Broncos here to be better than the market thinks here with respect to these other teams. I'd also include the win total in that. But if we're going to think that they're better than their win total, I kind of think that they might be the second best team in this division, and you're getting plus 600 to plus 650 on that bet.
Ooh, I love it. I love it. Great way to start there. And you're talking about maybe a lack of talent in one division. I feel like there's a lot of talent in our next division, which is the AFC North. And as we point to this division, you got Baltimore at plus 125 to win, Cincy at plus 165, Cleveland at plus 550, and Pittsburgh at plus 700. This is a super interesting division here. Division, yeah. First thing being Baltimore, obviously winning last year, but losing their top defensive player, McQueen, losing their defensive coordinator, and we know how big of a role he played on their squad last year. Now, if you're looking elsewhere in this division, I'm going to be honest here. Tell me if I'm crazy or not. But why am I looking at Cleveland at plus 550? Like, I feel gross doing it. I can't lie to you. But seeking some value, I'm like, I mean.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you, man. Like, at least from like a, strictly value perspective. And like, if all things go right with, by the way, like a coach of the year of 2 of the last 4 years in Kevin Stefanski, like if you're going to be able to rely on that, and listen, we talk about how coach of the year can be like a weirdo kind of award, right? It doesn't necessarily mean you're the best coach, but like 2 out of 4 years winning coach of the year is actually pretty legit. And defensive player of the year in Myles Garrett, and like a team that made the playoffs last year with like, we were 1 injury away from me getting the call to start throwing it around in Cleveland, right? Like Joe Flacco
last year,
and then wins, which is an insane sentence to even hear. But like wins comeback player of the year, and like we'll talk about some award markets here, I think, in a little bit. But it just goes to show, right? A guy who was not even on the field in October, I think it was, wins comeback player of the year. So yeah, it's kind of like it doesn't really matter who's in there. The Browns somehow make it work to a certain degree. The only problem here is that with the Bengals and with the Ravens, like you got to win a lot of games to win the AFC North, right? This isn't going to be like, well, we finished 10-7 and like we snuck in there to win this division. Nick Chubb out for those first 4 games, and who knows how long after that. Like, that's an interesting injury that like you might want to throw a couple of dollars around on Jerome Ford to maybe have a big season. Like, we're talking about a guy who's like 100, let me get this exactly right, 150 to 1 to lead the league in rushing. And if he's like running it behind that offensive line and getting all kinds of carries because they don't fully trust Deshaun Watson, or they don't fully trust Jameis Winston, which like is a totally viable thing to not trust, by the way. And he's 100 to 1 to lead the league in rushing touchdowns, right? So again, if you don't want either of those guys throwing once we get near the end zone, for a couple of bucks, like not a bad little sort of hedge on the idea that like maybe Nick Chubb, after a pretty devastating knee injury, isn't ready to come back. But on the flip side, if he is ready to come back and Watson ends up playing well, which like he showed some glimpses of last year, like we kind of still haven't seen him actually get in like full momentum where he isn't on the field and people aren't yelling stuff at him for the reason that he missed so much time after leaving the Texans, or at the end of his Texan tenure.
Yeah.
It's like the team does have, the talent that could kind of pull this thing off. And at plus 550s, even some plus 600s out there, that's all you can ask for a long shot bet there, because I do kind of want to fade Baltimore. And it seems like people sort of agree with that concept, but they're leaning more into Cincinnati. Like you can go over to DraftKings right now, and the Bengals are plus 145 and the Ravens are plus 145. Right? Like, so depending on where the sports book is, like in some cases, those two teams seem like they're on equal footing. Well, I'm going to have to do a little bit of talking myself into the Bengals defensively, who were just atrocious last year. And you can blame Joe Burrow's injury for why the Bengals didn't have a good season, but like Yeah, some of that affects the defense in having, Jake Browning out there and kind of maybe some short fields and maybe not sort of being able to be as aggressive as they might want to be. And of course, our boy Lou Anarumo, like we like him when things are going well, but nobody ever says like he's bad when things aren't going well. So I think a lot of people are talking themselves into Joe Burrow. If you're going to do that and you're going to think that the Bengals have a big season, I think you got to go the angle of like Joe Burrow MVP at 9-1. Right? Because it's like, yeah, okay, we could take him at, again, like I said, as short as plus 145 to win the division. But like, we just saw the MVP come out of the winner of the AFC North last year in Lamar Jackson, right? And his statistics weren't necessarily MVP like level as we've grown accustomed to. It was the fact that he was the quarterback on the best team in the league, or at least the best team in the regular season. And so that might be the play here as far as the Bengals are concerned. Joe Burrow to reach that high end element at 9-1. I think that's a more valuable play than like kind of chasing the steam here with Cincinnati, who, by the way, like speaking of injuries, right, as we saw last year, are one injury away from this thing completely falling apart. It just seems like the Browns aren't that one injury away from this thing completely falling apart, because they can have 5 injuries and still like be competitive. And they have the upside of like, well, what if all these guys are healthy and decent?
Yeah.
And it's like, now we're talking, right? Like they can beat Cincinnati. They have beaten Baltimore in the past. They beat both these teams in the past. We probably should mention Pittsburgh. Man, I want to get into Pittsburgh because you're like, oh yeah, they're going to have better quarterback play. And Mike Tomlin always makes the playoffs, always finishes above 500. And then for whatever reason, I stumbled into more Steelers preseason minutes this year than any other team, because it was like, all right, let's see how Justin Fields looks. Let's see how Russell Wilson looks. And the answer is just brutal, right? Like brutal in both counts. But like they had brutal quarterback play last year. I just think 3 teams better than them in this division is asking too much. And I would need something closer to that like Broncos number of like 20-1 or where the 4th choice usually sort of lands here on the odds board than a plus 700 to back the Steelers.
The only thing I want to bring up and ask you about in Cincinnati is there seems to be a lot of talk about Joe Burrow's injury and the wrist, and like, is it really going to be something that's lingering and long lasting? Because the flip side of this, because who knows, right? We're not going to know the truth until the season starts. But the flip side of this for Cincinnati is that they have the value of a last place schedule this year. No, like they have the value of like they have a way easier schedule than Baltimore does this year as well, right? Which gives a huge swing in such a tough division.
Yeah, and I think once you get through preseason, you kind of have a better idea of like maybe who's ready to go, whether there's actually, has anybody suffered any preseason injuries? Obviously, Burrow was like the headliner last year as far as a preseason injury. Like largely, we kind of escaped the like major catastrophe injury to a quarterback in preseason this year. And I think that once that kind of comes out and you gotta get a better idea of the power rankings of every team, what the expectation should be, then you get a better idea of a team's schedule. And so, yeah, like you look at the difference between Baltimore's and Cincinnati's schedule, like it is pretty drastic. And that is the thing I think that is kind of, people are looking at that going like, man, Joe Burrow, like seemingly healthy, hopefully the wrist thing doesn't become a, career long annual type deal. But like, yeah, like there's going to be a lot of easy wins, especially right off the hop here. I mean, just look at it from a stock bet, perspective, right? Mm-hmm. Baltimore's got to go to Kansas City on that Thursday night. They are the underdog in that game. Now, they may win that game, and of course, if they do, their stock will go up, their rating will go up, and their chances to win the AFC North will go up. Cincinnati has the sort of standard everybody's going to be on it in Survivor Week 1 opponent in the New England Patriots, right? Yeah. Like everybody's kind of chalking that up for a win. And I'm not saying you shouldn't chalk it up for a win, but when you're already sort of thinking that one team might be 1-0 and the other team might be 0-1, then again, things start to tighten up, and there's reason to kind of like, maybe this is the best price, at 165 that we see again for the Bengals for quite some time, because maybe they get off to that start where 6 weeks in, they're 5-1 and the Ravens are 4-2, and like the numbers have to change. Yeah. So, part of it is a buy low, sell high thing, right? And seeing early on in the season that the Bengals might have have a head start, if you will, right? We just watched a bunch of Olympics. They might be in that 9th lane with it's not necessarily a head start, but like they're just running ahead and like, do not look behind. The Ravens are coming. Like that might be the situation for the Bengals here if they can take care of business in week 1.
I definitely thought your reference for the Olympics was going to be Ray Gun, who I'm sure
We'll get there.
somebody in the NFL is going to have that as their touchdown celebration, right? Somebody's definitely doing that this season, right?
Yeah. Well, I think people are going to be doing the ray gun after getting hip drop tackled to try to draw that 15-yard penalty that's going to jam everybody up for maybe to the end of time, as every third guy who gets tackled gets flagged for a 15-yard hip drop tackle. That's going to be a nightmare, but not to bring the vibes down.
It's like drives. We'll save that. There'll be a lot of lamenting over this season for sure. A lot of lamenting going on in certain corners of the AFC East as well, as some of these teams are, I shouldn't say some of these teams, I guess, as I look on the board here and I see the New England Patriots as plus 2,800 to win the AFC East. If I go from the bottom to the top, Miami at plus 200, the Jets at plus 180, and Buffalo at plus 170. And of course, one thing that's important, as Matt's been mentioning, price shopping matters. These are just some 100%. Lines. There's going to be some different movement here depending on which book you're at. But as we look at this division, it does scare me, right? Like, I get Buffalo's a slight favorite, but I mean, I don't know what's going on there, to be honest. Old man Aaron Rodgers, I don't trust him. Tua, I definitely don't trust him in the Dolphins for a full season. So I don't even know which way to turn here in this division, if I'm being honest. I just know it's obviously not the Patriots. Help me out a little here, my dude.
Yeah, listen, man. Even odds makers don't really know what to make of this, because depending on the day, and literally today, like you go to DraftKings right now, and it's the second time I've referenced DraftKings. Like, I don't work at DraftKings; I just have their odds up. I don't work at any sports book, so we're free to say whatever we want over on this side. The Jets are the favorite at plus 165, and the Bills are plus 195, and the Dolphins are plus 205. Right, and they're so depending on the point during the offseason. Even the Dolphins have been favored within the division as well, which makes a lot of sense because, like, for a long time they were considered one of the best teams in the AFC last year, and don't have a ton of changes necessarily that would make you think that that's going to kind of fall off. So for me, it kind of comes down to, first of all, you can kind of get any one of these teams at or around plus 200. So you really do have to handicap it in a more aggressive way. You can't just kind of rest on, oh, this team's has a valuable price and, blah, 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 right? Like, they're all basically the same price. I will say this. I am not going to bet on Aaron Rodgers to stay healthy this season. I don't think it's going to be the fourth play untouched like it was last year. But I think that injury just saved us of two things. One, seeing Aaron Rodgers get injured in some other way at some point in the season. And two, maybe finding out, depending on what sort of, who you are, that Aaron Rodgers just isn't any good anymore, because he's 40 years old and a pretty slight quarterback who doesn't have a TB12 style, regime to make him sort of ageless in the way Tom Brady was able to still be awesome, well past his 40th birthday. So I think he's getting injured at some point. There, I said it, right? Like, I'm sorry. That's just, if we had to bet on something, and there are ways, of course, to bet on this, both, in an exact way and sort of in a roundabout way. And in this case, it's a roundabout way, which leaves to me, well, not the Patriots, because the Patriots are quite literally the definition of an also-ran. We are in an election year. Back in the old days, when a third candidate or a way down the ballot candidate was in the mix and they got 4 votes, they would be considered an also-ran. They were also in the election. The Patriots are also in this election. They are not in contention. They are not a threat to go to the White House, so to speak.
No new coach boost there, no?
I mean, there might be a boost, but it's like, and to what end, right? Like, is that even a good thing, right? Do you even want to be boosted if you're the Patriots this point? Because this is a team that is devoid of talent, because it's not like Bill Belichick couldn't coach at the end. It's that he could not draft worth a bleep at the end. And that was the thing that made that sort of end quicker than I think maybe a lot of people thought. So what's left for me is the Bills and the Dolphins. And again, we have to treat this from a stock market type perspective. And you go in and you look at the Bills' schedule, and right at the bottom of their schedule are 2 games in the last 3 weeks against the New England Patriots, which is going to come in handy for the Bills when they need wins late in the season. Like, being a heavy favorite in 2 of your last 3 games is going to come in handy. But that doesn't do you any good with regards to buy low, sell high, which is the game that we're playing here. And you look at the rest of the Bills' schedule, and it's like there's 3 games where they are projected to be. Of course, everything changes with injuries and all, and teams that we think are better or worse, or end up being better or worse than we think. But like they have like 3 games where they are a decent sized favorite before those late games in the season. And by the time they see the Patriots, it might be too late because the Dolphins, I think, at 11 out of their first 12, you'll have to, read my AFC East article to get that exact. I don't have that in front of me. But like 11 of their first 12, they are significant favorites on something along those lines. So like there's a decent chance they end up 11-3, and the Bills are kind of still as good as the Dolphins are, maybe even better. And they're sitting there at like a 6-5, 7-6, like just trying to, because they have 2 wins sort of banked late in the season. But that's not going to be reflected when the odds are out through the weeks, right? The odds for AFC East and all of the divisions are constantly out. It's not like we're making this bet and then never have to do anything again. If the Dolphins have a 1-2 game lead on the Bills, we can come back later on in the season, sitting there with our Dolphins plus 200 ticket and bet on the Bills to win the division. It's something I literally did last year. And we talked about,
we did
on
talk
this
about
show,
that down
right?
the stretch. A huge run for
Down
the Bills to end the season.
Yeah, and they go and they win that last game and they take the division, and it was great because we end up winning a ton of money there because we were able to have Dolphins plus 200 in our pocket or whatever it was obviously a plus money ticket, and then be able to take all those winnings or those projected winnings and shift gears and buy on the Bills. And that might end up being the case again this season, but there's no reason to bet on the Bills, especially as the favorite in this division, because of the question marks that we have regarding, how the offense is going to change. And even though I might be bullish on that, again, the schedule is what the schedule is, right? Congratulations, you got you won the AFC East last year. Now you got the first place schedule, and now admittedly the Dolphins would have probably traded spots and taken the first place schedule, but at the very least, the world's smallest consolation, they get a much easier schedule of this to start this season. So, and they're going to need it because they have a bunch of guys who are coming off of injury. We saw guys were playing, off the street basically in that playoff game against Kansas City on the defensive side because they lost Chubb, they lost Phillips. They were just losing guys left and right. So they got to get those guys back and in the mix, and a relatively soft schedule to start the season is going to help out Miami. And again, if I don't think that there's any longevity with regards to the Jets at the quarterback position, then I have to turn to the Dolphins in that way because I don't think there's longevity in the quarterback position for the Jets. And listen, if Aaron Rodgers plays all 17 games and the Jets are a Super Bowl contender because of it, I'll tip my cap, but it's not something that I want to bet at plus 180 for them to win the division with 2 other really good teams. That's just not what we're doing here.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, like I'm not the biggest Aaron Rodgers fan, but there could not have been a more depressing way to start the season than my guy running out with the flag and then plays it going down. And I remember staring at it like, really? Did that just happen? Like I've never seen that before. Like just to this wild swing, right? Of energy of him running into that building, the fans going crazy. He's got the American flag. Obviously, he thinks he's Captain America or whatever. You know what I mean? And it's just like, whoa.
And the subsequent reminder every time the Jets were on primetime the rest of the season.
Oh, yeah.
And now just thinking this year, and again, like I don't want him to get injured. This is where I think is going to happen. All Jets games are so much more interesting with Aaron Rodgers playing, right?
Sure.
Whether you think they're a buy or they're a sell or somewhere in between. Like even that Monday night game, right? If we found out that he like rolled an ankle and can't go in the Monday night game to start the season against your 49ers, like that would be a real drag because now we're talking about like 49ers minus 11 in that game. And it's like, okay, I guess we're doing this. Whereas like, I don't know, Jets money line for Monday night. Like I don't like maybe I just
keep seeing
like
that line being bet down. We'll get there eventually, but
that's
like,
and that's why I bring it up.
Yeah, down every time I see it.
We'll of course talk about it next week. But it's like, oh my god, really? We're getting down to that number, and obviously there's a couple different factors as to why that is. But yeah, so I mean, the football is more interesting when all of the teams are good. They are all never good, but as long as all of the like main pieces, because everybody's feeling good about their quarterback this season, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe other than the Raiders. But like at least every other team, like every team is, Will Levis, like we'll see, and like Anthony Richardson, like everybody's healthy, so all these games are interesting. You look at the week 1 slate, and you're just like, yeah, man, like give me all of these games. So, I don't want him to get injured from that perspective, but like I think there's a fragility to him that is not something I want to be on the side of betting with, at least from a long-term perspective.
Totally agree. And you said you don't know if all the teams are good. I don't know if all the teams are good in the AFC South, but I do know that the teams are interesting, right? For a lot of different reasons.
Same
Right?
thing. Yeah.
So the AFC South, you got Houston at plus 105, who of course had the epic season last year that everyone just was able to get behind and root for and cheer for and be happy for until they imploded in the playoffs. Story for another day. Jacksonville at plus 250, Indy at plus 320, and the Tennessee Titans at plus 900. The first thing that jumps off the page to me is the Tennessee Titans and how I'm going to have to keep reminding myself that I will no longer be able to just blindly bet on Mike Vrabel, whether it went well or it didn't go well. Like I just can't do that anymore. And wait, did I see that he's in Cleveland? Like he's like, what's his title there? Is he DC there,
like,
or is he just like
consult? No, like
consultant?
Consulting type of role. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. Which I honestly another reason to like the Browns, right? Like as this sort of like scrappy underdog type of thing, right? Like you're going to get good coaching out of the Browns, but it's not.
And the reason to not like Tennessee, but at plus 900, there's a lot going on in this division for sure. Houston was a great story last year. Can they do it again? I mean, plus 105. I know that's you're barely in the plus money. You're more at even money there, but you look elsewhere, Jacksonville and Indy. Which one of those two teams, if you were leaning one way versus the other, do you like more in terms of a value bet?
Well, I mean, let's quickly talk about Houston, right? Because at plus 105, that's a pretty short number. And for to make a bet on a short number like that, I kind of have to hate at least 2, if not all 3 of the other teams, in that division to make that a viable play. And I don't. I actually kind of like all 3 relative, right? Like we don't know that much about Tennessee and Brian Callahan. He's bringing his dad over to be the offensive line coach, and he's like, historically one of the best like offensive line coaches, on the planet. Like in the history of modern football. Yeah. And it's like, well, okay, if you get the offensive line going, there's a couple of pretty kind of fun tailbacks over there with Pollard and Spears. And okay, well, if you get the run game going, then all of a sudden things might open up for your guy, Will Levis. And then you look at the wide receiving core, which is all, for a long time been the most boring part about the Titans. And you're like, well, there's DeAndre Hopkins, there's Calvin Ridley, and there's a couple other guys who can play a little bit. And you're just like, the offense is like not bad as far as like you can kind of talk yourself into all the pieces kind of fitting together. Yeah. Then you go to the defensive side, right? And they still have some of the better players on that defense that, can be shaky. And that's why they're at 9-1. But it's like there's going to be some spots where they're going to be pretty significant underdogs or short underdogs to teams that aren't all that great, where you're going to want to bet on the Titans, not, obviously not because Mike Vrabel is there, but because of the idea that the Titans are on some like major rebuild. Well, again, we don't know that much about Will Levis. I think he was like 3-4 last year in 7 games as a starter, and 2 of those losses were in overtime. So there's a decent chance.
He had some moments. He had some moments.
He had some moments, and he, super athletic guy who can run the football and all of that kind of stuff, right? Which in this day in the NFL, you got to have that. So, okay, I'm not saying we need to bet on the Titans at plus 900, especially because I like the other 3 teams too, or at least sort of the next 2 teams relative to their price. Indianapolis, Shane Steichen. We don't know what we're going to get out of Anthony Richardson, who essentially played 2 games last year. Yeah. But Shane Steichen is a guy who, like, when he left Philadelphia, like things went to hell in a handbasket for the Eagles offense, or at least relative to when he was the coach there. So like they have a pretty good coach. They have some infrastructure there, a decent defense, and a quarterback with unlimited upside, who might stink. There we said it, right? We don't know. And so I don't necessarily want to bet that at a short price at plus 320, a relatively short price. And that brings us to the Jacksonville Jaguars, right? Who I think we have to remember, that like people are a little bit sort of out on the Jags because obviously they missed the playoffs last year and they had a bad second half to the season. The Jags are 8-3. at one point last season. And then Trevor Lawrence gets hurt in that game. And then your boy, CJ Beathard, comes in and just absolutely stinks it up against Jake Browning. And they end up losing to the backup Bengal situation. And then Trevor Lawrence tries to come back and play the next week against the Browns defense. And he's hobbling her out there on one leg and actually played pretty well. And that was a closer game than I think all of us thought it was going to be. But those are two losses right there, and he keeps going with it, and they lose to the Ravens because there's just a fumble on his part that was like completely ridiculous, and it just kind of falls apart from there. But if you can go back in time and bring that 8-3 record in and finish off the Bengals without getting injured there, now you're 9-3 and a healthy Trevor Lawrence. Like, that was a team that was looking to win that division. And when people look at Houston at a plus 105, like, yeah, they won. Obviously, they end up winning that division, sneaking that out. And the ticket that we ended up having last year, midway through the season, which again is just another example of, as much as we're talking about pre-season, as in before the season type stuff here, like a lot of valuable stuff is going to pop up throughout the season.
Which is also why you got to listen throughout the season to the pod.
That's right. Listen, listen, read, and follow along. Yeah. So Houston ends up finishing 10-7. Like, people act like Houston was like 12-5. Like, this was a team that, like, okay, they have to be even money to win a division that's getting more, a little bit better here and there with regards to talent and obviously more exciting quarterbacks. But like, everybody's kind of left Trevor Lawrence to the side, and like, at one point, certainly going into last year, people were throwing MVP bets his way in the summertime because they had come off of, honestly, a pretty similar situation that the Texans had last year, where it was like, yeah, they just barely won the division, and they had a big win in the playoffs, and then kind of just came up against a team that was just better than them. Of course, in the Jags case, it was the Chiefs, and in the Texans case, it was the Ravens. So like, yeah, the Texans have kind of gone all in here, adding Danielle Hunter to go on the other side of Will Anderson, but like, they got a ton of sacks out of Grignard last year on the opposite side of Anderson, and a couple other players that they've added as well. Obviously Stephon Diggs was the big headliner on offense, and so I still don't think the Texans are going to be that great at running the football. They added Joe Mixon, who for my money is just absolutely washed. Like, that was the most predictable thing ever, that the Bengals were moving on from Joe Mixon, because like, they know, and that's the thing in the NFL, right? When a team moves on from a player, it's like they know that player the best. And so I don't think that the Texans are going to be able to run the football. So it's going to be throw again for CJ Stroud. And like, that's going to work probably to the degree of another 10-7 season. But if we're talking about the Jags here, a team that didn't really lose all that much or all that anything relevant, it was a pretty good defense, decent, capable of a decent running game with Travis Etienne. And again, a guy who, for a long time we've thought was supposed to be a generational sort of level or potential level quarterback here in Trevor Lawrence. Like, CJ Stroud kind of stole Trevor Lawrence's like brand or sort of career in a way, right? Because he had like a really good season last year, obviously a historically great rookie season. And so I just look at it and I go, I think these odds should be a little bit closer than they are. But people are piling in on the Texans here, and that's pushing this closer to even money. And so for me, I think the only bet that I can make here is the Jags at plus 250, and hope that maybe they catch an early upset of the Dolphins in week 1, which I think is certainly possible, because I think when you want to play the Dolphins is probably early on in the season. Being a team from Florida, I don't imagine that they're going to have the same issues that some teams have when they go and play in Miami. But I think that it's, I don't want to say that Houston's not any good, or like, fade Houston. It's more just like, I think these two teams are probably closer than maybe the betting market is necessarily suggesting, because of how the season ended for both teams last year.
Yeah, I mean, this might be the perfect example of this division. This conversation on said division is a perfect example of what we're doing here on this pod, in terms of talking about the value that exists with taking Jacksonville over Houston, right? Like, it's just such an interesting dynamic, and something that we've seen play out over the last few years. But the last thing I want to ask you about the AFC here in particular is, if we were talking about a conference value bet, what do you think in there, in terms of, because obviously we know the Chiefs, they're, if you want to be on that wave and say they're going to
Yeah.
get there again, I still think it's going to be a tough go for them, it was a tough go for them last year, but seeking some form of value to win the AFC, what stands out to you there?
Yeah. I mean, listen, I'm not going to argue with you if you're in on a Chiefs bet. You look at the other divisions, and again, as much as I think Miami is a valuable play, at least to start the season with. One, I'm not telling you for sure they're going to win that division. I just think it's the place to start. And two, it can go wrong very quickly. If you're Miami, you kind of need to be the 1 seed, right?
Yeah.
Like they don't want to be doing this January weather,
We
Buffalo,
saw how
Kansas
that went.
City. Yeah, right. So it's like you could talk me into Buffalo, but I've just told you I don't really think that they're a valuable bet to start the season there. So I think the AFC East, you're kind of, all sort of destroy each other in a way there. I kind of think the Jags at 22-1 aren't a bad place to start, because what if you can project injuries in multiple ways, right? I was really impressed with the fact that it looked like Lawrence was going to be out for an extended period of time, and he's had other injuries. I remember there's one at Detroit where he was it looked like he was Homer Simpson bent backwards over the hydrant, and it was just well, he's done for the season. He was back out there in the second half. I think he's pretty durable guy, and so you can project injuries all you want, but what if there's a couple of injuries? What if this Jags team ends up winning this division and can maybe the Titans aren't as good as we think that they might be relative to their win total and their rating? What if the Colts aren't as good? What if what if Anthony Richardson does get hurt or whatever? And what if the Jags end up winning 13 or 14 games and getting that first seed and kind of putting it together? We're talking about a team right now 22-1. I think to win the AFC, again, at this point in this old grand scheme of things, you want to be kind of, again, plus 300 for the Chiefs. It's yeah, that'll look great when it's the AFC Championship game for the millionth consecutive season. And why I wouldn't, begrudge you doing that. And even then we talked about the Bengals, you have to be good if you're going to win the AFC North. But at plus 700, it's that's just not enough for me there either. But the Texans are plus 850 and the Jags are plus 20 or 22-1. And again, it's the same thing with the division. I don't know that there is that much of a difference between those two teams. And, maybe my fair price is Texans 10-1 and Jags 15-1, right? Which means there's not a ton of value on the Texans and maybe there's some value on the Jags. So that's just the way that I look at it. I think the NFC is far more kind of strong opinion, really into it, all that kind of thing. I mean, I can obviously mention the Browns at 20-1. And put it this way, the Browns at 20-1 and the Chargers at 22-1. It's just an insane, those aren't the same. Those cannot be the same thing, right? So you just look at the board and you're okay, what makes sense? And honestly, from a long shot perspective, the Jags make the most sense at a high price. And listen, the Chiefs always make sense, especially at plus 300 when they'll probably just. And again, they're from a rating standpoint, just real quick, the Chiefs, they have the highest win total relative to everybody else, but they're not the highest rated team for me because the 49ers have a harder schedule. But the point is that the Chiefs have those three teams that we talked about in the AFC West, which is going to inflate their win total, which is not great for betting their win total, but is super great for their place in the standings and their chances of being that 1 seed, right? So that's why at plus 300, you could certainly do worse. But again, if you wait, maybe the Ravens knock them off in that first game and there's a little bit extra value to be had on the Chiefs, after a slow start, which they have done before, obviously losing last year in the first game against Detroit. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen, but there's a possibility you get a better price on the Chiefs at some point this season.
One other question for you in terms of the AFC, any awards or long-term props, maybe coach of the year, anything coming out of the AFC that you're seeking some more value here while we're still here talking about this conference?
Well, every team sort of has a thing where it's okay, if they do this, i.e. win the division, right? If they have success, who gets credit for that success, right? And is that price so much better than the thing that they did, right? So Titans to win the division 9-1, right? If they win the division, explain to me how Brian Callahan is not the guy, right? How is he not winning a coach of the year or sort of in the mix? How is Callahan in the mix? And he's 25-1.
Yeah.
Right. So if your whole thing is like, I want to take a flyer on Tennessee winning a division, it's like, and by the way, like he might just win coach of the year without them winning the division. I mean, by and large, you pretty much have to win your division. Again, Browns didn't do it last year. So it's a decent example of like, okay, this guy kind of turning things around. AFC elsewhere in the AFC, I kind of like Josh Hines Allen,
Okay.
formerly Josh Allen of the Jags. He's interesting in the sack market at 18-1. He had 17 and a half sacks last year. It's a really big boost for him. That would have won, that would be most sacks in a lot of years. Obviously TJ Watt exists, and so he's the guy to beat pretty much every year when it comes to that. So I know I'm kind of getting like Jags here. Let me find you decent. We mentioned Denver Broncos, right? And and Sutton. He's 60-1 to lead the league in touchdowns. Now, the receiving touchdown market and results are always kind of wacky. The touchdown markets in general are always kind of wacky, right? Like if you ask people like who are the three guys who led in touchdowns and rushing, receiving, and passing last year, I doubt most people would be able to name all three. Right? Like you might remember that Raheem Mostert, led in touchdowns, but like even 2 years from now, we might completely forget about that because I think a lot of people have probably forgotten that 2 years ago, Williams for Detroit led the, and then wasn't even on the team the next year, led the league in rushing touchdowns, and then wasn't even on the team the next year. So the point is like things get really weird. He's a really big target, and I think if Bo Nix, like, he's going to be the guy that Bo Nix is throwing to, and it's 60-1. Like that's a pretty good sprinkle opportunity there in the AFC. Your guy Tua, 25-1 to lead the league in interceptions.
Okay.
Again, I like the Dolphins, but like they sling it around, and Tua like relies a lot on timing, and he was right up there in interceptions last year. That one's kind of interesting to me as well in the AFC. I'm just kind of scanning here. Speaking of the Dolphins, Devon Achan, however you want to call it, 28-1 to lead the league in rushing. The guy averaged 7.8 yards per carry over the course of like 100 carries last year. Number. Right? And again, as much as Mostert had all the touchdowns last year, you can't deny the talent is standing right there and not be like, okay, let's put this guy into position here to to get it done more often than not. And just the fact that Mostert's 90-1 to lead the league in rushing yards and Achan is 28-1, I think tells you all you need to know about sort of the difference in talent level and what we might be expecting here from the Dolphins and McDaniel's usage of the running back position. So there's a couple of super long shots. Of course, I'll have much more on this later as the season gets going. So feel free to check out the Substack when we start firing off those props.
Yes, for sure. And that, basically concludes our AFC portion of the season preview. And episode 1 of our season preview, we will be splitting this into 2 parts in which we will get the NFC in part 2. But as we wrap up this version of our season preview pod, Mr. Matt Russell, where can the people find you? Where can they find the work? Where can they find the whole grain goodness that they deserve?
Yeah, man, exciting new project over at substack.com/@mrustauthentic. It's the same handle that I use on Twitter. Just go to Twitter. It's in the bio. It's in the pin tweet. You can't miss it. It's in the description of this podcast. Hard to find it, hard to miss it. And it's free. And it's, people think Substack, they think subscription. It's free for the next calendar year. When I say it's an experiment, it's this sort of, market experiment thing that I'm doing to make it free for a year. And then we'll go from there. So come on in, subscribe, read all the stuff, 8 to 10 articles a week. If you follow my stuff over at The Score for the last 3 years, we do pretty well in this stuff, and that there's more than enough stuff to read during the week when you're at work. And of course, the podcast is back, the Window podcast, which Sheldon has been a guest on numerous times, and it's original fashion. Maybe we'll get him to come on a Monday or a Tuesday during the season. He can rant about things that he saw on Sunday. Fingers crossed on that. But yeah, that's obviously everywhere you get your podcast: Spotify, Google Play, Apple, all of that good stuff, and over at the Substack too, because everything's linked over there. It's a one-stop shop type situation.
Yeah, and especially as we head into this NFL season, people who have been following along, following your work that we do on the pod here, they know there's things the goodies of, one of my favorites, the round robin money line parlay. Like that's just,
Oh yeah.
Is that a thing that's going to be back?
That's a thing that's what everybody wants, right?
I gotta
people
ask
are
a
like,
question.
where's the rump? People are just constantly asking about the rump, which is not an Atlanta area strip club. It is the round robin underdog money line parlay that we do every week to see if we can't accidentally run into a big win while we're busy responsibly betting all of the other stuff that happens on the weekend.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. Well, as mentioned, this just wraps up episode 1 of our season preview pod. Stay tuned for episode 2, which will recap the NFC in every single division, give you value bets for the division, give you some props along the way, and of course, some other long shots, award winners, all that fun stuff. So wherever you're listening to this, episode 1, just scroll, hit refresh, and you'll find episode 2. And know that no matter what, after this week, heading into next week's games, we'll be back with normal episodes of the Clutch Picks Sports Betting Podcast, in which we'll break down every single game, every single week of the NFL season, trying to help y'all win some money. Again, my name is Sheldon Alexander. You can find me on Twitter at Shell Alexander, Instagram at Sheldon Alexander. And of course, as I always say, I used to pray for times like this to rhyme like this. This is the Clutch Picks Sports Betting Podcast. As always, unpolished and unapologetic. Until next time, see ya.